So in this segment, we're going to be discussing the UK risks disastrous food scandal due to lax post-Brexit controls. The National Farmers Union chief. So this is more stuff from Minute Batters, really. So Britain is in danger of a disastrous food scandal owing to lax post-Brexit border controls on agricultural imports. The leader of the UK's biggest farming association has warned, and it's already happening. We covered it at the time when tainted meat was being stopped at Dover. Phil refers to it as the kitchen nightmares of imports, which makes sense given the state of the stuff coming in. If you haven't watched that show, then it's rough. Without import checks, people will see the UK as a soft target for exporting tainted meat to, because we don't check things coming from the EU, but more importantly, the stuff coming via the EU. So anything moving via the EU from a third country to the UK won't get checked. Foodborne illnesses are always a danger, and we don't have a defence against it right now. The Tories won't do checks on imports because it costs too much to both the consumer and the taxman. And so she's right, we are not far away from a food scandal. Minette Batters, the president of the National Farmers Union, accused ministers of a dereliction of duty in failing to ensure food and other agricultural imports were safe. She said the government had failed to learn the lessons of the horse meat scandal of 2013. She said, quote, "We are seeing little to no checks on imports that are coming from the EU. We have the massive risk of African swine flu in Europe, and to not be investing in our defences for keeping our biosecurity and animal and plant health safe, I think it's just a dereliction of duty," end quote. And speaking of the horse meat scandal, Ireland first discovers the presence of horse meat at the end of 2012, so it was December, with lab test results coming back across the board by February 2013. So we're talking about the space of 2 to 3 months here of the lab tests being done. Companies really figuring out what's going on here, finding the horse meat and supplies of the horse meat as well, which is pretty quick in my opinion. Clearly there is a lack of testing being done by the different nation states and private companies. Generally, there are subcontractors which would supply a few key ingredients, beef in this case, and they basically kind of puffed it up with horse meat. They will try and cut corners. The situation is now, if the UK found a similar case of this without access to the EU databases, we'd find it very difficult to find the sources of the food contamination across the supply chain. Clearly, since 2013, government bodies within the UK have reduced the amount of testing, or at least that's what Batters is implying here. Batters said the controls were being eroded with so little checks on imports, and pointed to recent findings that many lorries entering the UK contained fraudulent meat. Quote, "If there was a food scare from Europe, it would be very difficult to trace it right now," end quote. Quote, "Many in food retail processing and manufacturing would say that on the back of Horsegate, we developed the safest, most secure food supply chain in the world. There was massive investment in safety and security and short supply chains," she added. "I think there's a real risk in 10 years on that we forget those lessons of the past, and there's nothing that will bring this country to a standstill quicker than a food scare. That would be disastrous, and we want to do everything possible to avoid that. But unless the checks are put in place and we can't trace everything, then of course we are at threat," end quote. And the situation is in the UK is pretty bad. The French mocked us for it, which was pretty funny at the time. But if people don't think the processed foods they eat, like ready meals, are not what they claim, do not contain what they claim, they'll stop eating them, along with takeout and other kinds of meals, maybe even the ground beef they find in the shops. If we run into a situation where the food that we have in stores at the butchers is tainted, we're running into a scary scenario, and it would not take many cases for this to happen. We're already seeing it with products being much shorter date, but for tainted stuff, this is far worse. The threat could grow much worse under the trade deals with non-EU nations, she added. The vast majority of food imports are still from the EU, where controls on food are similar to that of the UK. But under trade deals with Australia and New Zealand, that will soon come into force, and under potential future trade deals with countries such as India and Latin America, food could soon be arriving from regions with very different food standards and rules. I think New Zealand are fine because they do have equivalency with the EU, but Australia do use hormones and other nasty things on their wildlife. Latin America is the same. Brazil is a huge exporter in frozen chicken, and a fifth of the chicken they tried to export were contaminated with things like salmonella. This being reported back in 2019. Exports that are coming from Latin America would most likely be checked by UK border staff. I would hope that Australia and New Zealand would be the same, but the goods are moving via the EU potentially, which would most likely is what I'm nervous about here. They would most likely be moving via the EU and wouldn't be checked by border officials compared to Brazil. If you look at the geography, Brazil would most likely be a direct export to the UK, I think. Batters will address the two-day NFU conference in Birmingham, where government ministers and Starmer, leader of the Labour Party, will attempt to woo farmers who are in many cases deeply scarred by years of turmoil, buffeted by Brexit and the pandemic, in which food supply chains were turned upside down overnight. Farmers are now beset by rampant inflation, which has sent prices of fuel, fertiliser and animal feed rocketing. Starmer being there shows clear intent of his to woo farmers. I think the Lib Dems should really have gone, or should really go, because they need more rural support, and they would have got that. Look at when they took North Shropshire, for example. So a lot to be desired from the Lib Dems, but smart from Starmer. Consumers will also feel the effects. There could be a serious shortage of tomatoes and cucumbers this summer. Phil keeps talking about tomatoes, which is funny. Batters warned as growers were planting fewer than at any time since the 1980s. And we spoke before about key farming greenhouses who have sold up, and they will no longer grow salad vegetables like tomatoes, which is a real tragedy. But we are seeing less domestic supply of these vegetables, with imports becoming harder due to the import checks. So this makes a shortage more likely, and this domestic production will be reduced permanently. Yet at this crucial point for British farming, the Prime Minister, Sunak, turned down the opportunity to address this core group of mainly Conservative voters. Quote, the Prime Minister is doing a video, said Batters, and she says, quote, I think it's a real shame that he isn't there himself, but the leader of the opposition is there. I think that speaks volumes in itself. They, Labour, want to engage, end quote. And I think they used to send George Eustace, but I don't think he's a minister anymore. Batters said the Conservative government had failed to appreciate the impact of Brexit policy and economic headwinds on the UK farmers. Quote, what I probably worry about is the whole social challenge. Whatever you thought about the Common Agricultural Policy, which the UK left on Brexit, it very much ended up as a social subsidy to keep people on the land, end quote. And CAP has been criticised for giving payments to large landowners for just owning the land. I guess we can argue that having CAP meant that sheep farmers who were there as custodians of the land benefited, as they had land to raise their sheep on, and the sheep would manage the land from being increased fire risks. But CAP payments also went to farmers to help them with their costs. Given that supermarkets have a monopsony, I think is the term, they act as the single buyer, which helps them get lower prices on things like milk, but it means farmers make less money on their produce, as there are less buyers, less direct buyers. I think her main point is CAP was not properly replaced by the UK, which will impact farmers who act as land custodians. Farming in the UK looks like it's in danger. I hope that farmers finally get what Batters and the NFU have been warning them from since 2016. But if farmers keep voting for the Tories, this is on them, because they have messed this up for themselves. They have lost a lot in subsidies, and that's all on them, in my opinion. They were lied to, and they've accepted the lie. So if they continue voting Tory, sad times. But anyways, I'm going to leave it there. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe, support the channel on Patreon if you can, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.